Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another stupid video. I have done plenty of stupid videos, but this one is my tight and bound greatest 100 films of all time. This is my delayed reaction to Sight and Sound's 100 list, which came out in 2022, now that everybody's forgotten about it. So this is my just a bit of fun for the 100 greatest films that I have in my collection that I think are either great or influential. I mean, there's films in here that I don't particularly rank that highly, but I do like them. But everybody else thinks they're really good, so I'll put them in as a kind of time capsule of 100 films. There are some of the films in my favourites list, 100 favourite films that I did a little while ago, but obviously again I have only seen a fraction of the films that are supposed to be great. There's plenty of great filmmakers that I have not seen their films, and obviously there's other filmmakers that I have seen but my tiny brain cannot understand their genius, so some of those films probably won't be on this list either. But again, feel free to put your 100 greatest films ever made in the comments below. I have ranked the top 25, so that is actually ranked including what I think is the greatest film ever made. But numbers 100 to 26 are just alphabetical, so I'm not going to go into the details of the plots and all of that. I'm just going to go into my reasoning for putting them on the list. But again, this is just my opinion. Obviously, as we have established, my opinion is not fact. So let's get on with it. Starting at A with Billy Wilder's Ace in the Hole, with one of Kirk Douglas's finest performances. Again, this was made in 1951, but could have been made yesterday. Still relevant, as a lot of films made in the past sadly are, because as a race, as a species, we never actually learn. So a lot of these films, I think, appear on the list because, well, one, they've never been bettered, and two, they still talk about things that we still have problems with nowadays. Number 2, my favourite Scorsese film, but I do think it's the cream of the crop when it comes to costume, drama. Looks absolutely gorgeous. This was on my favourites list, but I do think it is a great and wonderful film. Next, Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. This is a monumental piece of work as far as scale. Obviously a lot of Tarkovsky films, for me, you have to invest not just time and effort, but you have to invest cellular activity in them. And this is a sprawling epic about the nature of the creative process and what fires that creative process. Next, Billy Wilder's The Apartment. Again, this still is relevant as far as people using people for their own ends and the hierarchy within the world of business and how management exploits the workers. And it's also got a brilliant script and brilliant performances. Then we have Apocalypse Now. Again, just for the scale, just for the sheer madness and lunacy, and that's just the Vietnam War, let alone the making of the film, which is perhaps even more insane. Again, great moments and set pieces, and more cinema as experience. If you wrote Apocalypse Now, the book, it just wouldn't have the same effect as Apocalypse Now, the film. O Hazard Balthazar by Bresson. Again, this is more about the human race, how we treat animals, how we treat ourselves. And it's just Bresson showing us, via the use of a donkey, how awful we are. And again, we just never learn. Terrence Malick's Badlands. Again, I'm not a huge fan of this. I do think it's very good, and I obviously have it in the collection. But this was kind of a changing view. This is 1973. Again, the beginnings of criminals as celebrities, and the draw, the allure of killer culture, and like most Terrence Malick films, it looks absolutely wonderful. And probably the first wild card, Baraka. This is one of those films that is about cinema as experience. If you watch it on as big a screen as possible, it's just a series of images, and if this doesn't make you feel pointless and small, then I don't know what will, in our place in the universe, in our place on Earth, because obviously there's lots of human beings who think they're special and unique and important, and if they die the world will stop turning, but the world will not stop turning. And then Barry Lyndon by Kubrick, which just looks like a series of paintings that are put together. Absolutely beautiful, but it's also one of Kubrick's funniest films, and it's just a wonder, even though again it's not my favourite Kubrick film, but it is still, like most of these films, a fairly astonishing piece of work. Next, Sean Cocteau's La Belle et la Bête, which perhaps is the definitive version of Beauty and the Beast. Again, this is in here for the magic of cinema and what a spell you can create just by simple techniques. You know, obviously the special effects in this film are rudimentary, but it's just shot in such a dreamlike way and a poetic way, that it doesn't really matter. This one is about the magic of cinema. The Big Sleep, just about perfect in the kind of film that it is. The on-screen chemistry is wonderful, obviously, between Bogart and Bacall, and it's a rip-roaring mystery, and the dialogue is absolutely wonderful. And for films of this kind, it's certainly one of the best, and for two icons, it's in this list. Blue Collar by Paul Schrader, for the people who say Indicator don't have great films in their catalogue. This one again, from 1978, sadly still as relevant today as it was then. Again, how workers are exploited and kept apart, but in general how the working class is kept fighting amongst each other rather than actually fighting the people who make all the profit. Great performances, incendiary film, and one of the best debuts in American cinema, or cinema in general. David Lynch's Blue Velvet, still transgressive and nasty and difficult to watch, unlike a lot of the films today that claim to be difficult. They're not actually. This is still a dangerous film, but just filled with that Lynchian horror and beauty in equal measure. Not L'Age d'Or, but in Chien Andalou, which is still, all these years later, is still jaw-dropping, still wonderful, still challenging, pushed the boundaries, and that was in 1929. It's still an amazing piece of work, and I've put that on the list because of that. Perhaps not Orson Welles' most famous film, but Chimes at Midnight, which for a lot of years was in butchered versions, like quite a lot of Orson Welles films. But this mishmash of Shakespeare stories, again, very much like Citizen Kane, could almost be the story of Orson Welles. One of the best battle scenes ever filmed for literally no money, but just has an atmosphere and is completely tragic. So that's Chimes at Midnight. Chinatown. Again, I'm not a huge fan of Chinatown, but it is still very, very good. One of the best, if you want to call it, a mainstream American Hollywood film, 1974. Great turns by everybody involved, an intelligent script which you have to pay attention to, and a wonderful climax. Again, I'm not the hugest Chinatown fan, but it's still a wonderful film and looks fantastic on the big screen. Citizen Kane, yes, it's easy to bash Citizen Kane, the way certain other classics over the years have kind of been, well, it's not actually that good, but then you kind of watch it, and I mean, technically it's jaw-dropping, acting wise it's wonderful, including Wells himself. So yes, it's easy to knock Citizen Kane, and it's probably not anybody's favourite Orson Welles film perhaps, but it's still a landmark film, and again, for somebody at age 25, still very impressive. Crash by Cronenberg. It just about people who need to push boundaries in general. Again, how our lives are ruled by technology and machines, which is also a common thread throughout Cronenberg's work. I actually saw this in the cinema, believe it or not, before it was kind of forgotten about and banned for a lot of years. It's just an absolute masterpiece and one of the greatest films of all time. Dead of Night, which might not be in anybody else's list. Yes, it's got a weak comedy story about golfers, but so many wonderful moments, and for a portmanteau film, it probably has the greatest kind of connecting tissue story, and the whole thing is just one big nightmarish loop, which is just absolutely wonderful. Another Cronenberg, Dead Ringers, which perhaps might not be in anybody else's list, but again, this is the definition of how to have one actor doing two performances, and again, it's just Cronenberg's evolution from the early kind of body horror exploitation films where nobody really took him that seriously because he was doing, they couldn't get past the effects, whereas this is more psychological and kind of more, I wouldn't say intelligent because all of Cronenberg's films are intelligent, but more cerebral, but still challenging and difficult. And Cronenberg at his best makes the viewer feel uncomfortable and think about things they don't want to think about. So that's Dead Ringers, which is an important part of cinema. Next is 8.5 by Fellini. Now again, this is another film that I'm not a huge fan of, but again I do need to rewatch it. I do say it has a wonderful beginning, it has a wonderful ending, it has a wonderful last kind of 20 minutes as well. But for me, the middle part perhaps gets a little bit bogged down. I mean, for me, there's no reason for the film to be 138 minutes, but that's just me. Again, lots of people think it's amazing, so I've put it on this list. I'm being magnanimous. Next, The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On by Kazuhara. This is a film. It's a documentary, and this is in the list because this is an example of how film perhaps encourages the subject, how film and filmmakers can perhaps get lost in what they're doing, the idea of complicity, the idea of people doing things for the camera that they shouldn't be doing or normally wouldn't do. At what point as a filmmaker do you intervene when things are going off the rails? This is an incredible film, first brought to my attention by the wonderful Daisuke Beppu. Just ridiculous, and you pretty much won't believe what you're seeing, but definitely should make the list just for that. Brunel's Exterminating Angel. Again, it's absurd, but it has so much truth into it, as a group of dinner guests can't leave the room, so they resort to all manner of behaviour. It's basically a microcosm of society and the decisions and choices that we all make, regardless of how sensible they actually are. Faust. This is absolutely an amazing film from 1926 by Murnau. The images in the film are just amazing. There's been lots of versions of Faust, but this is absolutely astounding. The whole film's amazing, but the first half hour, 40 minutes is just incredible. Next, Funeral Parade of Roses, which I've included as a look into a subculture that not all of us know about. Certainly the subculture in Japan that we're not all used to seeing. And again, this makes the point of showing you things that you have not seen before, a part of society that you may not be familiar with, in a country you may not be familiar with. And that's the power of cinema. It's the power of, certainly if you're living in an English speaking country, why quote unquote world cinema is so important, because it will show you people around the world that go through similar things that you do, and people in the world that you're not exposed to, but you learn more about them. So that's why Funeral Parade of Roses is in the list, and it's also really good as well. A film that was in my top 10 favourites, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Don't really need to talk about that for much more than that. Kitano's Hanabai. Again, not my favourite Kitano, but certainly you could argue the most Kitano. Kobayashi's Harakiri. Powerhouse performance by Nakadai. And again, a film that questions the samurai code, the Bushido, and sometimes how rules and codes and laws are strangely enough set up just to exploit people. Beautifully shot. Again, see it on a screen as big as possible. I really need to rewatch it because it has been a while. His Girl Friday, just about as perfect as a screwball comedy can get. This one is really fast paced. Cary Grant's absolutely wonderful. Directed by Howard Hawks. And this Criterion also has the 1931 version of the front page as well. This is more of a personal pick, but The Holy Mountain by Jodorowsky, which was in my favourite list as well. To me, this, especially the ending of the film, is one of the greatest statements on cinema itself. Yes, it's a wild, wacky journey, but the actual final scenes are some of the most truthful in regards to what cinema is, and what cinema represents and what cinema should be. Next, Jaws. Yes, Jaws is in the list. You could argue the negatives of Jaws is that pretty much invented the summer blockbuster. But for me, this is as good as Spielberg got. This is when Spielberg actually did interesting things with the camera. And it's in here really for a film of just great moment after great moment after great moment. But obviously it is responsible for summer blockbusters, which isn't necessarily something to be celebrated. JSA by Park Chan-wook. This is in here as an example of the modern Korean wave. Obviously there's other more famous films that would maybe make this list. But for me, this is one of the most important because it's about North Korea and South Korea. But from a bigger standpoint, it's about why can't we just get on? Which again, none of these world leaders are watching all these films that tell us we're all the same round the world and why can't we just get on. They're not watching those films, unfortunately. Another Kobayashi, Kwai-Dan. This is just in here because it's absolutely gorgeous. Elaine Rennie's Last Year in Marienbad, or At Marienbad. This is just phenomenal. Looks beautiful. This is in here really because it's got so many different interpretations. And again, it's a perfect example of why cinema, people can watch a film and have a completely different reaction or a completely different reading of a film than somebody else. As I've said before in this channel, arguably the greatest edited film of all time. People literally turn their head and they're in another room. Does it all make sense? Who knows? But by jingo, it's fantastic. Lawrence of Arabia. Pure spectacle. Is the second half weaker than the first half? Yes. Could it have been shorter? Yes. But this is just as big as cinema gets. And again, watch this on the screen as much as possible. And again, it's a film, an example of a film that you can get different things out of. If you just like spectacle and a big epic, you can get a lot of pleasure from it. If you like war stories, you can get a lot of pleasure from it. Or if you want psychological portraits of a sociopath, you get a lot from that as well. M by Fritz Lang. This is one of the templates for serial killer films. Absolutely beautiful and a landmark, and that's why it's on the list. And also is very, very good. Make Way for Tomorrow by Leo McCarey. This is brutal about how we treat our old people. Certainly on the cover it looks as though it's going to be a laugh a minute. It is not a laugh a minute, but it's such an important film and one that everybody who has parents should see. Manhunter, another top 10 film for me, I believe. Michael Mann at his best. and the benchmark for modern serial killer films. Yes, its soundtrack is dated, but that hardly really matters. And Brian Cox is the best Hannibal Lecter, hands down. Manila and the Claws of Light. This is another example of seeing a world that we're not familiar with, unless you live in the Philippines. But a common story. A country boy comes to the city looking for work and hope and money and dreams, and it gets completely shattered and perverted. Wonderful. Another top 10 film for me is Miller's Crossing. Probably nobody would have it in the 100 greatest films of all time. But I have it because it's perfect. And I think if a film is perfect, it should be in with a shout for the 100 greatest films of all time. A Chaplin film. I need to re-watch a lot of his films, but my favourite is Modern Times, because again it's still relevant all these years later. It's more political than some of his other films, it's less sentimental than some of his other films, but I do need to re-watch them. But Modern Times is quite wonderful. Another Lynch, Mulholland Drive, which didn't actually make my favourite 100, but it's fairly close to it. What does it all mean? Does it really matter? You just go on the journey of pure Lynch in Hollywood. Satyajit Ray's Music Room, which is a wonderful, beautiful, tragic film about the passing of an age. Just wonderful. I keep banging on about this film, but I'm going to keep banging on about it. Elaine Rennie's My American Uncle. I think this was there or thereabouts, the top 10. Just love it. Mike Leigh's Naked, his wonderful knockabout comedy starring David Thewlis. That's perhaps a lie, but it does star David Thewlis. Misanthropic and nasty and horrible, but absolutely compelling. And you definitely need films like this in the world. And I think you need films like this in the Titan-bound 100 greatest films. Next, Napoleon. Again, just a technical marvel, but really good storytelling as well. It does rattle along, even though it's 332 minutes. And while I wouldn't say, I mean, I personally wouldn't give it 5 out of 5, but it's not that far off. Just astounding. And again, if you watch it on a really big screen, it's even better. Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen. Took me a while to watch it, but it is an amazing piece of work. And this is the basis, it's not the first like fantasy film or whatever, but it's certainly the basis for quest films. There's a lot of Lord of the Rings in this. And it's just a sensational journey, and again at 282 minutes it might seem daunting, but again once you go on that journey it does go by fairly quickly. Night of the Living Dead. And again, people might argue it shouldn't be on the 100 greatest films list, but for what it inspired, the landmark that it is, now whether that's a good thing or not a good thing, I'm sure Romero would sit here now if he was still around going, are people still making zombie films? But this is more than a zombie film. This is, again, Romero, he always had a kind of socio-political through line in his films, even if it was, his films were genre based in a genre that doesn't get much respect. But this was more about people just having the dream of making films with not a lot of money in their hometown, on location, and obviously this one struck gold, even though there was like viscera and guts hanging from that gold. Nosferatu, or the unofficial Dracula film, but they couldn't call it Dracula, by Murnau. Absolutely beautiful. Is there better versions of the story? Perhaps. But it's still just a wonderful thing to look at, and the nice tints. I said tints. Another film that's in my favourite list that I've mentioned a lot of times, but I'm putting it in the greatest list just because. Mario Monicelli's The Organizer with Mastroianni. Yes, it's a political film, but it's got humour, it's got tragedy, it's beautiful, an unusual performance by Mastroianni as he's playing a scruffy professor as opposed to the usual kind of character he plays. Just an absolutely stunning film when I saw it, and it continues to be stunning. So that's The Organizer, which you should really check out if you haven't. Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas. One of the most beautiful films. Wonderful score. Not a lot of dialogue, but you don't really need dialogue. And obviously a great cast. Harry Dean Stanton and Dean Stockwell and Natasha Kinski, and it's a tremendous piece of work. Again, watch it on a screen as big as possible. The Passion of Joan of Arc by Dreyer. The importance of close-ups in cinema. Obviously there's some filmmakers that don't really use close-ups. This is very simple but really powerful, and again, which way around? Again, it's just the power of pointing a camera at things. Pather Panchali. Has Sajid Ray made better films? Perhaps. But this is just so beautiful, so simple. And again, for somebody with no training, his eye for composition is astounding. The use of nature. And it's almost the greatest hits of Ray. The old world meeting the new world, etc. A good place to start. Next, Peeping Tom by Michael Powell. The film that practically ended his career because people just weren't prepared for it. Still stands up today despite obviously some of the dialogue being a little bit dated. Prostitutes costing £2, for example. But the sympathetic killer was obviously one of the problems. But it's still just absolutely wonderful. And Michael Powell playing the father who tortured little Mark as a boy is just a wonderful touch. Bresson's Pickpocket. Yes, critics might say this is his most Hollywood film, if you like. But I love it and think it's fantastic. And I think it's great as well. That's why it's on the greatest list. Proving his life after the age of 70, or Kurosawa's Ran. Is it my favourite Kurosawa film? No. Is it a stunning cinematic achievement? Yes. Rossellini's Rome Open City, which is just an absolute stunner. But Paisa and Germany Year Zero are almost just as good as well. Germany Year Zero, a film that we didn't really see, World War II, or the end of World War II from Germany's perspective. But Rome Open City from 1945 is jaw-droppingly good. It's brutal. You're not expecting it to get as brutal as it actually does from a film from 1945. But blimey, it gets brutal. But all three of these films are absolutely wonderful. But Rome Open City is genuinely great. Next, just for knockabout comedy, Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom. I don't think I've actually talked about this on my channel. Pasolini's final statement, and what a happy-go-lucky statement it is. Now, if somebody else had made this, would this be talked about as much? Probably not, but not everybody would have made the choices that Pasolini did. One of the rare films in my collection that I haven't actually rated. I think I've rated it in Letterboxd, but I'm not actually sure. But certainly in my spreadsheet and in my books that I write all my films in, I've left the rating blank for Salo, because it's somewhere in between a 1 out of 5 and a 5 out of 5, but my mind changes all the time every time I watch it, which is obviously not that often. If you're watching Salo probably more than once every couple of years, there's something a little wrong with you. If you're sitting about going, it's Saturday night, it's Salo time, there's definitely something going on. Mizoguchi's Sancho the Bailiff, Sancho Deu. Don't have a lot of experience with Mizoguchi, but the three that I have experience with are all fantastic, and for me this one's the best. Joseph Losey's The Servant, again not my favourite Losey, but it's probably in my top 3. Again, a lot of Loseys are about class and role reversal, and this is absolutely wonderful with Dirk Bogarde. And James Fox, there is a 4K of this. Let me know in the comments whether I should upgrade this to 4K. Next is Sherlock Jr. by Buster Keaton. Obviously the General does appear on, I don't know whether the General was in Sight and Sounds 100, but I'm weird and I prefer Sherlock Jr. because it's actually got something to say about cinema itself. The scene where, you know what scene I'm talking about, is just absolutely sensational. So for me it's Sherlock Jr. from 1924, but I mean the last 20 minutes of Steamboat Bill Jr. from 1928 is just absolutely astounding, with a storm. It's absolutely incredible. But for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to go with Sherlock Jr. Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. Again, one of the best films about Hollywood, and Hollywood does like films about itself, even though this is quite dark. Is this certainly one of the, or arguably the first film where a corpse is narrating the film? Just again, very much like Jaws, just so many wonderful classic moments after classic moments, but obviously unlike Jaws, didn't start the summer blockbuster trend. Second Scorsese, Taxi Driver, is one of the few Scorsese classic films that still stands up for me, about isolation in a big city, and certainly in the 70s New York you can almost smell it, and just Travis's lack of understanding about what the quote-unquote normal world is like. I do identify with Travis Bickle a lot. Another Fritz Lang, Testament of Dr. Mabuse. Perhaps Dr. Mabuse the Gambler is in the Sight and Sound list, I'm not actually sure, I didn't pay that much attention to it. This is a nice steelbook of the sequel. This is definitely odder and goes into weirder places, but it's quite wonderful. My favourite, Terrence Malick, The Thin Red Line. Talked about this a lot, just absolutely wonderful. Shizlovsky's Three Colours Red. Obviously the trilogy is getting a 4K quite soon, which I've obviously pre-ordered, because that was one of my reasons for getting the 4Ks, because these films are wonderful, and Shizlovsky's wonderful. Throne of Blood, Kurosawa. This is in here for being arguably the best Shakespeare interpretation without using Shakespeare's language. Obviously Orson Welles did some rather good ones as well. But Throne of Blood is just so good, and it's always been one of my favourites, but it's also one of the greatest. Orson Welles' Touch of Evil. Again, you can make the loose theory that he started film noir with Citizen Kane, ended film noir as an exercise with Touch of Evil. So dark and creepy and uncomfortable, but again just full of classic lines and classic moments, and a classic performance by Orson himself. 12 Angry Men, great script, great use of the camera by Sidney Lumet, and his debut, pretty much shooting in one room with multiple actors. The blocking is exquisite, each character is defined. Yes, there's silly things like Henry Fonda being able to smuggle in a knife, but the acting's fantastic and the script is so good, and there's so many mic drop moments. You didn't really mean you wanted to kill me, did you? Next, a complete oddity that would certainly never be in anybody's greatest 100 films of all time list. Vampire Kiadachuk by Per Portabella. I still have no idea. Very much like Sallow, this is difficult to rate for me. It might be the greatest film about filmmaking ever. It might be the greatest Dracula of all time. Or it might be one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. I still don't really know, but there's something going on. Dreyer's Vampire, which is one of the strangest vampire films, if you like. Completely odd and dreamlike and expressionist, but it's one of the films that is the closest to dream logic, and it's just wonderful, and that's why it's on the list. Now, this is a filmmaker that I've always taken joy in knocking a little bit, but this is Vertigo by Hitchcock. If I had to have a Hitchcock on the list, I might go with this one, so I've went with this one. Everybody loves it. I still think it's a good film, but I don't really understand the craze for it. I mean, I think, was this voted number one now? I can't remember. Obviously it was Citizen Kane for a while, but I think Vertigo's taken over The Godfather. I haven't really kept up. But again, it's a good film. I'm not saying it's a good film. Every Hitchcock film that I've seen is a good film, but I just don't get Hitchcock's the love for the man, but that's just me. There's lots of filmmakers that I love that nobody else does, so it's absolutely fair enough. Another film that I keep banging on about, objectively, is that one of the 100 greatest films of all time. You could argue, but I'm sticking it in anyway. It's Tsukamoto's Vital. One of the greatest films about mortality. When you literally are dissecting your ex-girlfriend for your anatomy course. It's absolutely beautiful and absolutely wonderful. And then finally, I've got two more before we hit the rank 25. Nick Rogue's Walkabout. The transition from modernity to the past. Absolutely gorgeous film. Does much happen in it? Perhaps not. It's about nature, man's relationship to nature. One of Jenny Agutter's finest performances, and just an absolutely beautiful film. And then finally, outside the 25, Kurosawa's Yojimbo has been remade so many times. Obviously this was inspired by a book initially by Dashiell Hammett, but this has been done so many times before, just like another Kurosawa film that might appear in the top 25. So that is number 126. So now we're going to enter the 25 greatest films ever made, in my opinion, which doesn't matter. So at 25 is a French film. It's Melville's Le Samouraï. arguably the best Man and His Room film. DeLon is just super cool. The palette of the film, the ending of the film, the feel of the film, the atmosphere of the film, it's just so wonderful, and that's why it's the 25th best film ever made. At 24, Christ Stopped at Eboli by Francesco Rossi with Gianmaria Volonté. You knew Volonté would turn up at some point. And this is here because I have no idea why it's so great. It's about a guy who gets sent to the country as a political prisoner in this tiny little village just to hang out for a little while in exile. It's 220 minutes long. He just wanders about the town talking to people. But it's magical, it's simple, it's moving, it's tremendous, and I don't know why. So this is why it's here at the 24th greatest film of all time. Just because it's the magic of cinema. Because on paper, Christ stopped at Eboli, not stepped on Eboli. Poor Eboli. You know, on paper this shouldn't be so amazing, but it is. I don't have much experience with this director, as everybody knows, it's kind of a running joke. But Late Spring by Ozu, I'm not going with Tokyo Story, spoiler alert. I'm going to go with Late Spring, which is just absolutely beautiful, and the greatest apple peeling scene in cinema history. That's why it's in the 100 greatest films of all time. Next, Powell and Pressburger's Black Narcissus, the greatest nun film of all time, the greatest film where somebody wears a pair of shorts, the greatest film where somebody threatens somebody else with some lipstick. Just a sensational film from their sensational run of films in the mid to late 40s. Next, Agira Wrath of God by Herzog. Again, trance-like, hypnotic, but without putting people under hypnosis. Klaus Kinski at his most Klaus Kinski. Just a tremendous film that at times you think must have just been a documentary, then you realise no, it's actually a film. Or is it? Or is it a dream? Who knows? Next, I had put this as my favourite film of all time, even though, as I said in that video, my top 10 is fluid. But Carol Reed's Third Man does make it into the top 25 greatest films ever made. It's just all the elements of a lovely little thriller, but enough oddness, great score, great performances, great characters, great ending. So that's why it's number 20 in the 100 greatest films of all time. At 19, certainly the shortest film in this top 100, Rennie's Night and Fog, from 1955, only 32 minutes. This is a film that I'd heard about its reputation, and 20 minutes in, it was like, yeah, this is fine, just going about the ruins of Auschwitz and other places with dialogue written by a survivor. Everyone's fine. And then the last 10 minutes happened, and then I was weeping like a small child. Those tracking shots of just endless rooms, just rooms of like endless piles of hair or shoes or glasses, was pretty overpowering, and it's still overpowering. So proving you don't really need a big long film to address the inhumanity and the horrors that we can do to ourselves, and it seems to be the only thing that we're actually good at. And maybe I shouldn't have put this right after Night and Fog, but to be or not to be, I think this is the highest comedy. I absolutely love it. Yes, it's bittersweet because of Carl Lombard, but I won't go too much into detail about that. Lubitsch just being absolutely wonderful Lubitsch. Next, Tarkovsky's Stalker. Again, characters go on a journey, the viewer goes on a journey. Tarkovsky's use of water and nature and ideas and mystery are at times overpowering, and I'll admit sometimes my tiny little brain can't handle it, but Tarkovsky's Stalker is certainly one of the greatest films of all time. At 16, Kurosawa's Akiru. Again, this is here not just because of Shimura's towering performance, but because again we never learn from it. When his co-workers realise what he's done before he dies, they all sit there and go, oh, I'm going to change my life, oh, I'm going to do things differently. And as we all do when somebody we know dies, and we say, oh, I'm going to take advantage of life and I'm going to do things differently, we never do. We go back to the same pointless, dull routine, and we just go back to doing what we do. And Kurosawa wasn't afraid to kind of show that, and that's why Akiru's here. Next, Seven Seal. Again, you could argue this is another one of those, oh well, it's very much like Citizen Kane, it's good, but you know, there's better. But then you watch it and you realise how amazing it is. Again, the most underrated thing about Bergman is his shot composition, which in this, like a lot of his films, is absolutely stunning. Next, it's another Archer's, sorry, it's Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. One of the most underrated triple performances by an actor, Deborah Kerr. Anton Walbrook has one of the greatest speeches in cinema history, period. And it's another film that took a long time to get restored. Obviously Churchill didn't like it, but unfortunately it still contains lots of truth that we still don't learn from. Can somebody actually watch these films and learn from them? Speaking of which, is this the most modern film left? At number 13, it's The Act of Killing. This absolutely blew me away the first time I saw it, and this is about the power of filmmaking, because something happens about 3/4 of the way through that made me weep for somebody I wouldn't necessarily weep for. When a huge penny drops, it's just phenomenal. Watch the longer director's cut, which is on this disc rather than the theatrical. It's jaw-dropping, but it's also absolutely amazing, and it's hard to believe it's already 11 years old. But The Act of Killing, documentary by Joshua Oppenheimer, you can check out The Lucas Islands as well, which he made before but he released after, for fear of reprisals. But The Act of Killing is just amazing. Next, Persona, Bergman. Again, not my favourite Bergman. Do I completely understand it? Yeah. But images, the power of the performances, again, the composition, use of the camera, is absolutely exemplary. So that's Persona at 12. At number 11, Shizlovsky's Blue, Twacular Blue. absolute perfection. Great score by Preisner. Not going to go on about that. Number 10, we're in the top 10 greatest films of all time, according to my pathetic opinion. All of Melville's films, no. Army of Shadows. I do keep saying I need to get the Criterion Blu-ray, but it's really expensive to have a separate copy of it. Army of Shadows, the best Resistance film, because it's not all one-sided. There is tons of grey, just the way it's kind of shot. Just absolutely wonderful. At number 9, it's another Bergman, which coincidentally is my favourite Bergman. Arguably the best road movie ever made as well, even though it's never really cited as a road movie, but it is. About an old man played by Victor Sostrom, looking back at his life and the regrets of his life. Ingrid Thulin is sensational in it. Everybody's wonderful in it. And it's just, and again, it's one of those films that as I get older I appreciate even more. It's just another phenomenal Bergman film. At number 8 is a film I certainly don't watch every Saturday night. Surely nobody does. Shoah, which, in opposition to Night and Fog, is quite long, but it's absolutely brutal and essential. It's just a bunch of interviews. I think we all know what it's about, but it is an achievement. I think that's the best way to describe it. At number 7, again, another film that you'll maybe roll your eyes at and go, oh really? But it is Seven Samurai. The influence is immeasurable. Probably every 8th film made is basically Seven Samurai, just with different settings and characters. For a film that's over 200 minutes long, it flies by. Great compositions, characters, multiple characters that you actually care about. When people die, you're actually upset, which again doesn't happen that often in films, but you genuinely miss the people that don't make it in Seven Samurai. Just an amazing piece of work, visceral, the dynamic camera. Seven Samurai, man. Number 6, Once Upon a Time in the West. It was higher in my favourites, but it's only made number 6 here. Just perfect. Myth making, the story of the West, capitalism. Number 5, Come and See. Just absolutely brutal. If you like your war films with big bangs and guns and excitement and heroes, this isn't it. This is just brutality and horror and ugliness, even though there is quite a nice stork in the film. And there's not too many Blu-rays whose cover just sums up the film perfectly. It is just an absolute piece of work. At number 4, Kubrick's 2001. Never really been bettered as far as space films and the look of outer space and ships in space. The use of a song or a piece of music in a film and then being synonymous with that film has never really been bettered. When you think of the Blue Danube, you think of 2001, even though it's been used countless adverts and countless everything else. It's one of the rare films that no matter how many times I watch it, I do get a sense of awe. I did kind of fall out with it for a while and didn't really watch it for a while. but then watching it again over the last 5 years or whatever, and now seeing it in 4K. I mean, it's the thing about it again. I know how they did stuff, but the magic's still not broken. Yes, as I get older, I could do less monkey action, but as what cinema and the possibilities of cinema can do, show you things that you're never going to see in your Dickie Mint. Number 3, but there's still 3 films that are greater. It's The Red Shoes, which if you've watched my favourite films, I almost thought about not putting it in my favourite 100, but then seeing it again in 4K, it's like, don't be an idiot. This is arguably the greatest film about art, and it's also one of the greatest pieces of art. About the sacrifices for art, what you're prepared to give up for whatever you love, whatever your passion is. If that's eating cheeseburgers or writing poetry or making films or dancing or playing the trombone, what are you prepared to give up? It's, again, 1948. Nobody was making films like this in 1948. Just ridiculous. And it does align with my recent theory that Powell and Pressburger were in actual fact aliens and were not human at all. They came from a completely different planet, and we were just lucky that they visited for a while. At number 2, the second greatest film of all time, Kobayashi's The Human Condition. Now you could make the argument, is it really a film? Is it not 3 films? I don't care, it's one big film. And this is just stunning. Again, as I've said before, it took me far too long to watch it. To make a 90-minute film that is amazing and a masterpiece, is the odds on that are astronomical. To make a 574-minute film is just mind-blowing. The central performance by Nakadai, the central character of Kaji, is one of the greatest characters. Not perfect, makes mistakes, so he's not this idealised central character that you get in a lot of films. Again, why do we keep making war? Again, is nobody watching these films? Obviously no world leaders watch The Human Condition. It's just an absolutely stunner, and again, I'm just embarrassed that it took me so long to watch it. But that leaves the greatest film of all time, in my ridiculous opinion. And again, it's a film that I waited way too long to see. It's Bondarchuk's War and Peace from 1966-67, which would never have existed if King Vidor hadn't did War and Peace with Audrey Hepburn and Henry Fonda, and it enraged Russia so much that they decided to make their own film. So instead of like going to war, just make better films than each other. This is 422 minutes. It flies by. This is insane. Every frame of this film is like a museum-sized Napoleonic painting. Even the parts that aren't as engrossing as other parts are still stunning. Russia opened up 58 museums so they could use the props for the film. Bondarchuk had like 2 heart attacks while making it. They built half of Moscow so they could just burn it down. They just put a camera and tracks all the way around the set and then set it on fire. It is ludicrous. It has that Russian philosophy, the narration over it. If you watch Thin Red Line by Malick after watching War and Peace, you might think that's kind of where Malick got those narrations that are philosophical, and but of course this one's in Russian, so it makes it even more deep and philosophical. I mean, Beyond a Truck actually plays one of the characters as well, as if he didn't have enough on his plate. The logistics of some of the scenes are mind boggling. They got the Russian army as extras. Again, this ain't CGI. It is just mind blowing. You might have to go and close your eyes for a week to recover from watching it, because there's a chance your eyeballs will actually just drip down your cheeks while you're watching it. It's so gorgeous, but again, it's also about the stupidity and the arrogance of the human race, because even the peace isn't that peaceful. We still have to kill things, we still have to hunt things during peace. It's almost as if the human race is just a bunch of selfish idiots. But cinema is a visual medium, and this is just ridiculous visually. Again, maybe it's just me, maybe there will be people that watch this and just go, that looked alright. I think I haven't really read, I've just imagined it, that a 4K of this is actually illegal because people would die if they saw a 4K of this. But I've just made that up in my head, but it's completely true. You would die if you saw a 4K of this. So for me, I've now watched it 3 times, and every time I had to go and lie down for a few days. So this is why War and Peace, to me, is the greatest film ever made. But by all means, let me know your 100 greatest films that have ever been made. And hopefully you'll join me again for less stupid videos. So thanks very much for watching. Obviously that has taken a large part of your life up, and you haven't really had much reward for it, and I apologise for that. I will send out a batch of chocolate watches to you all. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll try and make more sensible videos in the near future. This is Saoirse Ronan from Saoirse Ronan Films, saying I appreciate your sacrifice, and farewell.